Good evening. My name is Erik Olsen. I'm a researcher and PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Let me first thank the American Embassy of Moscow and the American Center of Moscow for hosting this discussion about the American presidency this evening. I'd like to talk about the birth of the American presidency, what it is, how it functions, how it's created, and what the role is within the American system of governance. What I'll discuss today are the origins of the office of the President of the United States from the period of the Articles of Confederation, about 1781, with the first American Constitution, to the current American Constitution created in 1788 and ratified in the following year, as well as any pertinent amendments that were created via the Bill of Rights. Next slide, please. The President under the Articles of Confederation. Created in 1781, the Articles of the Confederation and Perpetual Union created the first government of the United States in Congress assembled. The first Constitution of the United States also created the office of the President of the United States, Congress assembled. The role of the President of the Congress of the United States, President of the United States, Congress assembled, was closer to our modern Speaker of the House of Representatives than the current office of the President of the United States. The authority of the Articles of Confederation were simply not robust enough to allow for effective management of the federal government. George Washington's comment on the demise of the Articles of Confederation was simply this: no money. Washington's statement was meant to illustrate the great importance of the first government, the general impotence of the first government that was unable to compel various states into unified action. Among problems identified within the Articles of Confederation were that states had routinely and unilaterally enacted their own embargoes, practiced their own foreign policy, raised their own funds for war, and pursued policy objectives independent of the nation at large, all of these actions being wholly unsuitable to the requirements of a robust national government. Why was the ineffectual Articles of Confederation passed and the President of the United States Congress assembled created? In order to answer this question, we need to answer a more basic question. How did the colonists see themselves? I've taught in Amsterdam and the Netherlands for a long time, and one of the questions that I like to ask my students there is that as members of the European Union, when they travel abroad and let's say they're traveling and sitting in a cafe in New York, and at the next table they might meet somebody or hear somebody speaking French, do they reach over and say, "Hello, my fellow European, how are you? My brother. We are all both in this strange land, and how do you feel about that?" Well, this would be a very odd thing for modern Europeans, whichever their member state is, to think of themselves. They still think of themselves as Frenchmen, Dutchmen, previously Englishmen as well, Germans, and on and on. Well, this was the same with the early colonists. For the early colonists, their self-identification was not necessarily as Americans of this new country. They saw themselves much more as Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, North Carolinians, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The President of the United States Congress assembled. In total, there were originally 8 serving presidents that served in this role. And so George Washington is most commonly considered the first president of the United States, and that's true under the Constitution. But previous to the Constitution, under the Articles of Confederation, there were actually 8 presidents who served. Aside from the problems with the Articles of Confederation as a whole, the office of the President of the United States Congress assembled was quite purposely given a minor role. The minor role of the president under these short-lived Articles of Confederation reflected the relative weakness of authority of the articles themselves. To sum up, the only authority granted to this role was as follows. He served, much as the Speaker of the House, as the presiding officer of the U.S. Congress. He was also the chairman of what was called the Committee of States. And so when Congress was in recess, it was the Committee of States that managed the day-to-day affairs of government. Unfortunately, and the president was the head of this body. Unfortunately, the body fell into infighting and was quite quickly dissolved. The president was also charged with undertaking various sundry administrative tasks that Congress needed. Uh, this first American Constitution was quickly discarded in favor of the idea of the co-equal branches of government, which are now the executive branch under the president, Congress, and of course the courts. Next slide, please. Current President of the United States. Adopted in September 1787 and ratified on the 21st of June 1788, the U.S. Constitution has been the guiding document for U.S. government for the last 235 years, roughly. Under the newly consecrated U.S. Constitution, the office of the President of the United States was created under Article 2. It also includes regulations on how the office of the Vice President was to be created. Now, it's important to understand that the placement within the Constitution is quite telling. Congress was the first article. The president was still seen as, in some ways, equal but secondary to Congress. So he was created under Article 2. Section 1 of Article 2 creates and outlines the general terms of the office of the president, which bestows all administrative and executive authority. The term of the presidency would be 4 years. Qualifications for the president would be that the person would have to be a natural-born citizen, to be at least 35 years of age, and in the case of those born before the second Constitution was written, to have resided within the United States for at least 14 years. Succession of the president to the vice president, in case the elected president died, was also provided for. It also covered the pay of the president, created the Electoral College, and created what we know now as the oath of office. Section 2 denoted the authority vested into the new office. The president can make binding treaties with other nations, provided that the Senate ratifies those. With Senate confirmation, the president can appoint ambassadors, justices to the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as various ministers and cabinet positions. However, the president was free to appoint lower-level appointees. So the assistant secretaries, so on and so forth. The power to make appointments when Congress was not in session was also created, and this is called a recess appointment. These appointments would be reviewed by Congress during their next session, but the president would be free in the case, let's say, the president felt that he might have an unpopular candidate, but really wanted this person to serve in a particular role. The president would wait until Congress went into recess, put in the recess appointment, and maybe perhaps convince Congress in the time after that the person was suitable for this role. The President of the United States was also created as the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces when such forces were called up. The president could seek advice from his cabinet, but of course was free to ignore such advice as he saw fit. And cabinet appointees, after ratification by the Senate, really served at the president's pleasure. The president was free to dismiss them at will. The president's role as chief executive was also given the ability to grant pardons for crimes committed at the federal level. Now, this is important. Sometimes people are convicted in what we call state court. So the state court of New York or the state court of New Mexico. And the president does not have the ability to pardon people convicted of crimes in state contexts, only under federal contexts. Section 3 described the relationship of the president to Congress, as well as obligations that the president had to Congress. These included that the president gives a State of the Union address to the fully assembled government. This is Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court. And this would happen once a year. They may convene either or both houses of Congress. The president can determine a date that Congress must adjourn if the two houses cannot agree on such a date. The president is the face of the United States, and as such, the office receives emissaries and other foreign officials. The president enacts the laws that Congress passes. Section 4 In the case of malfeasance, the U.S. Constitution also allows for the removal of the president from office. This mechanism of impeachment in the House and conviction within the Senate is something that maybe some people have been familiar with lately, since this was a process that was occurring at the very end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020 with President Trump. Now, a president could be removed from office if he is found guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. What this means is that the president would be the equivalent of an indictment, which is really what impeachment is decided in the House. And once the House of Representatives gets a majority to agree to articles of impeachment, those articles are brought forth to the Senate. The Senate then convenes a special court, which then decides on innocent and guilt. Now, it should be noted that this is a highly political process. Anybody who had been watching the process unfold at the earliest part of this year would understand that this is not the same process that we have in a legitimate, well, I shouldn't say legitimate, but we have in a standard or regular court of law. Now, Article 1, Section 7 lists the president's role in the passage of legislation that's issued from Congress. When legislation is presented to the president, he has three options. He has the ability to sign the law, and then it becomes active. The bill may be sent back to Congress because the president vetoes it. Now, if the president decides to veto a law, Congress would have to have 2/3 majority vote in favor of the law, and then it passes and becomes law. The president also has a third option, and this is called the bill may be unsigned and yet still left without a veto. Upon the end of the 10th day that the bill is presented to the president, one of two things happens. If Congress is in session, the bill becomes a law. And if Congress is in recess at this period, the bill doesn't become a law, and this is termed a pocket veto. So this is a way to get around the veto process and get around the signing process that the president is not left to actually commit, but of course, something happens as a result of his inaction. Next slide, please. The Electoral College. The U.S. Constitution does not provide for direct popular election of the U.S. president. In other words, the people of the United States don't directly vote for their president. We vote for our member of House of Representatives, we vote for our representatives in the Senate, but we don't actually vote for the president. The U.S. delegates to various state legislatures the power to choose electors, and assembled, this is called the Electoral College. Although the precise process of the election for the electors varies from state to state, typically electors are chosen in conjunction with the candidate they pledge to support. By original practice, this pledge had no binding power upon the elector, who until recently was able and free to choose among the various candidates regardless of the popular vote. Now only by recent tradition and some state laws, electors are required to conform to popular will. However, if they decide to forego popular will and vote on their own, there are civil and criminal repercussions that could follow. The number of electors permitted to each state is determined by adding the number of representatives that they have in the House of Representatives, along with the number of senators that they have, which is always 2. This gives us 535 electors. But the District of Columbia, which is the seat of the federal government, also is allowed to have 3 electoral votes. And so the total is actually 538 electors. Electors meet in their respective states to cast ballots for the president and the vice president. Now, originally, each elector cast 2 votes for president. At least one of the individuals being voted for had to be from another state. And so if there were 3 candidates, 2 of them from the state of New York, electors in the state of New York were not allowed to vote for both of those New York candidates. They could vote for one, and then they would have to vote for the third. The individual with the majority of votes became the president. The runner-up became the vice president. And in case of a tie, the House of Representatives could choose the candidate themselves. So they would go to an immediate vote. This means that the office of the president and the vice president couldn't be occupied by two people who had residence in the same state. Historians agree that the reason for establishing indirect elections for the presidency was that the framers held great reservations about allowing the general population to elect their chief executive directly. Rather, it was felt that highly placed people in the community were the best judges for determining the overall welfare of the entire community, whereas those people of lower classes would simply vote for their own particular interests. Today, almost all states have what's called a winner-take-all system. And so, for example, in the state of California, New York, Texas, which have the largest amount of electors, whichever candidate wins a plurality of votes in those states gain all of the electors. So all of those votes go to that candidate. Now, the only exceptions to this are the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska, and they use a proportional system to dole out their electors. This is where we come to what's often termed as a red state and a blue state. So political scientists and observers, especially during the run-up and during election time, have understood that the population of particular states vote in a majority in one favor or the other, either Republican or Democrat. And so Republican states are often termed red states, and Democratic states are often termed blue states. Now, this is not necessarily something written in law, and obviously as the populations change and voting patterns change within those states, we could see that a red state might flip to blue, or could also be a state that is up for grabs for either party. Next slide, please. Now, there are several adjustments that had to be made to the office of the president. Sometimes they didn't work exactly as planned. And there were problems with the 1796 and the 1800 elections. And as a result, Congress proposed what is now known as the 12th Amendment. This was created or proposed on the 9th of December, 1803, and ratified on the 15th of June, 1804, barely 6 months later. The 12th Amendment introduced certain changes to the procedure to vote for the president. Electors do not cast two votes for president. Rather, they cast one vote for the president and one vote for the vice president. In case no presidential candidate received a majority, the House again chooses from the top three winners. The amendment also requires the Senate to choose the vice president from those with the two highest totals, if no vice president candidate receives a majority of electoral votes. To be eligible to serve as vice president, a candidate must be eligible to serve as president. Now, an interesting discussion had come up. I'll get to this when we discuss the the last amendment, but do you have to be eligible to be president to be further down the line of presidential succession? So if the sitting president becomes incapacitated or dies, the vice president then assumes office. And the vice president, or the new president, chooses his own vice president. But in the case that the vice president and the president become incapacitated or die effectively at the same time, the Speaker of the House then would become president. And the line of succession then goes down through the cabinet. Now, while it is required to be able to serve as president to assume the role of vice president, this is not true for people downstream from the vice president in the line of succession. So the Speaker of the House could be under 35, doesn't have to be a natural-born citizen, or fulfill any of the other requirements that are necessary to be elected directly to the presidency. The 12th Amendment, and this is where the 12th Amendment clears up some of the vagaries in the Article of Secession. Now, this need would change, and these requirements would differ when presidents and vice presidents ran on the same ticket. So in modern elections, we don't simply vote for a president and a vice president separately. We voted for President Trump and Vice President Pence at the same time and with the same vote. And it's often termed that they are running on the same ticket. Next slide, please. Now, further adjustments to the office of the president were under the 14th and the 22nd Amendments. Now, following the end of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was passed. This 1868 amendment, among those known as the Reconstruction Amendments, contains Clause 3. And this prohibits the election or appointment to any federal or state office of any person who had held any of certain offices then engaged in insurrection, rebellion, or treason, unless a 2/3 vote by Congress overrides this. What does this mean? For officers of the government of the Confederacy, when they went into rebellion in the 1860s, those persons would be ineligible to serve in the future government. Now, in practice, by 1898, Congress decided to all but remove this provision from the amendment. And of course, at a certain point, the people who would have been ineligible have simply died off. And so passively, that clause just was not germane anymore. And it didn't prevent its use in 1919 to deny office to the Socialist Party of America candidate for the House of Representatives, and his name was Victor Berger. Now, during the middle of the Great Depression and throughout World War II, we had the longest-serving president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was elected to office 4 times, and in fact, we don't know, maybe would he have been elected a 5th time had he lived. So the people of the United States kept electing Roosevelt until he died. But this was seen as possibly problematic for the Republic. We didn't want to find ourselves in a situation where a president would be so popular that they would be a de facto president for life, being voted in election after election and really only being checked every 4 years as part of this process. In order to avoid this, in 1951, the 22nd Amendment was passed, and it set the term for how long a president could be in office. Now, I would like to read from this section directly, because I think the language of it is important. Section 1 reads, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of the president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of the president when this article was proposed by Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of the president or acting as president during the term within which this article becomes operative from holding the office of the president or acting as president during the remainder of such term." Which is to say, had this been passed in the mid-1940s, when Franklin Roosevelt was alive and was the president, this wouldn't automatically remove him from office. He would be allowed to serve out his term, but would be forbade from serving further terms. Now, since the Ronald Reagan administration and about his second administration in 1985, there have been constant attempts to either amend or to repeal this. And arguments to the nature of, well, let's say Ronald Reagan serves as president from 1980 to 1988. And then George Bush Sr. is elected president in 1998. Is Ronald Reagan then eligible to be reelected in 1992? Well, under Article 20, the 22nd Amendment and Section 1, he wouldn't be eligible. So it's 2 terms. But this also counts if, let's say, for the sake of argument, Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980. And then he loses the 1984 election to Walter Mondale, who was the opponent in that year. Now, what happens then is he comes back into office in 1988. So he's reelected in 88. He served a term 4 years from 80 to 84, and then from 88 to 1992. Would he be permitted to run for office again in 1992 to serve 2 consecutive terms? He would not. So it's 2, whether consecutive or non-consecutive. And some suggestions to alter this had been to remove the consecutive provision. And so that in the scenario I just presented, some have argued that, well, maybe it would be okay if they were first non-consecutive, elected, a term out of office, reelected again, and they're reelected to a third, but non-consecutive from the first term. Other suggestions would ask that if Congress votes and overrides the amendment by supermajority, which is a majority not merely more than 1/2, often 2/3 or 3/5 of Congress in each chamber. So if a massive amount of representatives and senators in Congress were in favor of overriding this, well, maybe then we can discard this idea. None of these suggestions really have gotten too much traction. And I think part of this is that for people who argue in favor of this, it's maybe a positive thing if their person is put into office, but perhaps not so positive if they're found in the other position and there's a popular opposition president who's able to take advantage of these same provisions and is elected to more than these 2 terms. We have a little bit less time than we usually do, and I've tried to condense down the lecture a little bit because I'd like to give the viewers a certain amount of time to ask some questions. So if we can have a question period for, looks like it's 5:30 now, for about a half hour, and I'll be happy to field questions on any part of the lecture I'd given, or if people have other questions related to the presidency, I'm more than happy to field those questions as well. Ah, okay. Um, sure, sure. How many viewers do we have? Hmm, wonderful. Now, well, I'll speak a little bit until some questions come up. One of the theories that was created in the 1970s by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. We have a question. So, what was the most controversial election in American history? Great question. I'll probably discuss modern history. and what was the most controversial election. And I think it would be safe to say it would be the election of 2000 of George Bush against Clinton's vice president, Al Gore. So this was an incredibly contentious election. And in fact, it was so contentious that it went to the Supreme Court to adjudicate. And the Supreme Court had decided in favor of candidate Bush over candidate Gore. And so, in effect, it was the Supreme Court, arguably, who chose the president that year over any of the processes that I've mentioned. And in fact, some post-election analysis, looking at the votes, looking at who would have won if counting had been continued to its natural conclusion, was that it was likely but not assured that Gore would have won in 2000. So I think it's safe to say that this was probably, at least in modern history, the most controversial election. What is my attitude towards Donald Trump? He's the president. He won the election. I know there was a lot of teeth gnashing when he won by certain members of the electorate, specifically those people who were in opposition to President Trump. But I think in order to understand the election of President Trump, we have to go back to the election of his predecessor, Barack Obama. And in much the same way, to understand Obama, you have to go back to Bush. Each one was really in many ways a reaction towards the other. The great amount of dissatisfaction with the Bush era really led people to desire a sea change, a huge sea change in the way we've elected presidents and the type of people we've elected in the past. And so we had Barack Obama become our president in 2008. Now, there were a number of people who very openly felt and articulated it this way, that the election of President Obama meant that they lost their country, that America as they knew it was gone. And of course, for the people who supported him, they were elated with his election. The election of President Trump, we could almost switch those sides. So the same people, by and large, who were very happy with the election of President Obama, felt that the election of President Trump was the end of their country, was the end of the United States as they knew it, and for all of the worst reasons. And so my attitude towards President Trump is that he's as polarizing a figure as President Obama was. In some ways fair, the criticisms, in some ways maybe not so fair. So I think that would be the way I would answer that question. Why is Vice President the head of the Senate? Is it a violation of separation of powers? No. So the Vice President, by and large, doesn't have many jobs to fulfill. One of the jobs he does have is as president of the Senate. So the Senate, unlike the House of Representatives, is always made up of two senators from each state. So 10 states, we have 20 senators. 50 states, we have 100 senators. And the vice president is there in order to break ties. And so if the Senate is deadlocked, really the most operative role that the vice president has there is to break those deadlocks. But strictly speaking, he doesn't vote for legislation. He doesn't take an active role in the other processes of Congress. And the separation of powers is often a misunderstood concept. So by separation, we don't mean that there are strict and impenetrable boundaries between what Congress does, what the president does, and what the courts does. These are three branches that work together. And so this is really a good example of how they work together and a mechanism that's created for it. Who's the most important person in the U.S. right now? Good question. Very often the most powerful person is understood to be the president, because of the awesome amount of powers and authority that the presidency has. The president is elected by the whole country, whether through electoral votes or popular vote, whereas other members of government are either appointed by a president and put into their offices by Congress, in the case of cabinet members or, let's say, the Supreme Court justices. And of course, senators and representatives are voted by their particular constituencies. So the president is often accorded vast amounts of power. Since this is somewhat germane to contemporary situation, a discussion has been, there's a Defense Act, and the exact name of it is slipping my mind right now. But essentially, the president during national emergencies and during periods of war has extraordinary authority to order U.S. corporations, U.S. industry to retool and produce items that they normally are not associated with. And so some discussion about ventilators being produced by General Motors. I believe the Tesla company had volunteered and are making masks and whatnot. And although this has been on a voluntary basis so far, if necessary, the president has absolutely the power to do this. I could be cute and say that the voter is the most important person, because without the voter, people don't get into office. But really, it would be fair to say that, the president of the United States, with the ability to vast great deals of authority, especially in times of national emergency, is, if not the most powerful, certainly among the most. Do I think the U.S. is ready for a female president? Sure. I think the idea, and this is been a puzzling mentality for me for a long time, that when we talk about equal rights, some people seem to understand equal rights as having somebody from their particular demographic or gender fill a particular office or a particular role in society, and that this would be proof of equality. Private conversation, someone had suggested very early on during the Democratic primary season that all male contenders should drop out of the race and only leave female contenders there, because in this person's opinion, it was time for a woman president. And I think this is really a fundamental misunderstanding of equal rights. And to my mind, it's not a question that we're a success if we have a female president, but we have achieved greater equality of rights between genders or other demographics, if you choose, if the best candidate is elected president, regardless whether they're a male or a female. And I think that this is really the right way to look at this question. So I think by and large, people are ready for female president, but that candidate has to be the best candidate. And so by putting one's thumb on the scale and following, let's say, the suggestion of the person that I mentioned, this is not the right way to elect somebody of a particular gender. I would have been very happy if, my preferred candidate, whoever it happens to be, is not the gender they are or another gender. This is really immaterial to me. And if you would have asked me actually in 2007, if the American public was ready to have a African American or part African American, because Barack Obama has an African father but a Caucasian mother, was the American public ready for that? I probably would have told you that I would see them much more ready for a female president than either a mixed race or an African American or particularly Latino president. So yeah, I think we're certainly prepared for that. No problem. Let me just make sure I'm getting the questions. So question 10, what happens if the electors do not follow the public choice? Well, it's a good question. This really is a state-to-state issue. So in some states, the electors could be arrested and face criminal prosecution for this, go to jail. By and large, the idea is that the electors vote according to the will of the popular vote of their particular state, except in the case, of course, where I noted exceptions of Maine and Nebraska, where they use a proportional system. So theoretically, sure, if somebody is willing to face either a financial fine or criminal prosecution, they could cast their vote as they want, but there, of course, will be consequences for it. Question 11. The electoral vote always comes first. What if there is a huge difference between the popular vote and the electoral vote? Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the electoral vote comes first. The presidential contest is decided by electoral votes. It's not decided by popular votes. This was made, if people had not understood this in 2016, they sure understood this right after 2016 vote. So Mrs. Clinton, by tally, won the popular vote. And people who were supporters of her, at least detractors of President Trump and his win of that election, pointed to this constantly. She won by 1 million more votes, 2 million more. How many? 2 more votes. It doesn't matter. It just simply doesn't matter. The contest is not decided by popular votes. It's decided by electoral votes. Now, there are some arguments that if we get rid of the Electoral College and we just go to a pure popular system, this will create a huge inequity for certain states, certain parts of the country that would vote, let's say, Republican, or they would vote Democrat, that they would just be completely steamrolled. I think this is really a false argument. Because what I mentioned previously is that we have red and blue states. So, for example, my home state is Texas, or my home state is New York. And Texas is a decidedly red state, but I vote Democrat. Well, it's a winner-take-all system. My vote really doesn't count. All of those votes went to the Republican candidate. If I was in New York, which is a fairly reliable blue state, if I vote Republican for the presidential contest, my vote's not counted. But if we put the vote at large, meaning that we get rid of the Electoral College, we don't even discuss state-by-state votes, it's just one vote, one person, I think we would have a much truer understanding of what the popular will is. And this is what I mean by popular controls. And so then the popular vote counts. There is no electoral vote. Question 12. And does it happen often that a candidate wins thanks to the Electoral College vote while the popular vote chooses another candidate? It happens, sure. There's a famous picture of Truman, and Truman is holding up a newspaper from the day before that says Dewey wins, and he's laughing in the picture because Dewey won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. And so Truman became president. This happens. I think that people really make a big mistake by focusing too much on the popular vote outcome and not understanding the mechanism of the Electoral College and how that works. Because, again, that's how that contest is decided. If a cabinet member was not born in the U.S., will he be included in the line of succession and therefore become president? Well, that was what I was discussing before. So the only person who is required to comport to the requirements of the presidency to hold office is the vice president. So there is no, how do I explain this? The Secretary of State is very high up in line, I think number 4 in the line of succession. And let's say the current Secretary of State was born in Germany and came to the United States as a teenager. So they're not a natural born citizen. And they were not born to American parents. So fully a German citizen that became naturalized, came over, and was appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate to be the Secretary of State of the United States. President, vice president, Speaker of the House, all become incapacitated or killed, or die, I shouldn't say killed, or deceased, then the Secretary of State would assume the presidency. And there's absolutely no requirement that he be a natural-born citizen. In fact, he could be a 25-year-old person, 10 years younger than what the requirement is under the Constitution to be elected to that office. So I think the controlling factor here is elected to office, not necessarily what happens with the line of succession past the vice presidency. Could I recommend some literature for my research on Russia's image in American presidential discourse of the 21st century? It's a good question. Something I might have to get back to you. I'll be happy on the comments on the YouTube recording here to offer some suggestions. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of any, but I'll certainly be happy to get back to you on that. Which woman will Vice President Biden choose for his running mate, in your opinion? Well, Vice President Biden is an interesting character. I would say probably no woman in his particular case. Very early on, I believe it was around 2016, Vice President Biden. Sorry. I'm thinking of Vice President Pence currently. I'm not sure who he'll pick. And I'm not sure if it'll necessarily be based upon gender. So I think it's a little bit too early in the contest. And political scientists and pundits love to try to account or give odds for who a particular candidate will pick as their running mate. Often they're wrong. So let's say for candidate Clinton, people had come up with a wide variety of possible vice presidential candidates that she was going to pick as her running mate, and I don't think Tim Kaine was very high up on any of those lists, but he was picked. So your guess is as good as mine. What do delegates and superdelegates have to do with this election process? Okay. So there's nothing within the Constitution Nothing within really any of the founding documents that says that we are a two-party system, that the Republican Party and the Democratic National Committee have a monopoly on higher office, whether it be voted into Congress or voted into the presidency. This is really a de facto situation. It just happened. They happen to be the two most powerful parties, and arguably there is in many ways not too much sunlight between them. Most of the differences between the two parties tend to be rather superficial, by and large. They agree on many, many more things than they disagree upon. I don't want to go into that too heavily, but their processes, their internal rules, they're all different. And they're private organizations. They are not public organizations. So one of the discussions that came out of the 2016 primaries between Hillary Clinton and Bernard Sanders was the how fair does the Democratic National Committee have to be in picking their candidate? And this went to court. And the lawyer for the DNC has said simply, we could smoke cigars in a back room and decide between 5 people who our candidate's going to be. We set up this voting process, but we're under no obligation to follow it. So I think this is quite telling. Superdelegates were created after a crisis within the Democratic Party. And superdelegates are members of Congress. Often ex-members are made superdelegates. And they have, in proportion to average voters, primary voters, much, much, much more voice. And so I don't want to go too deeply into the primary problems between Clinton and Sanders in 2016, but superdelegates are really a way for the DNC to have kind of its own electoral college. If they don't want or trust the popular will of the Democratic primary voters, they have superdelegates or people of high esteem and position who have a vote, but a little bit more of a vote. And so they have an ability to have a much larger voice in that deciding process. This is not really a mechanism that you see on the Republican side, for a variety of historical reasons. As I know, the term of vice president is not limited. So, for example, Biden could have served as President Hillary Clinton's VP for 8 years or more. Is it right? Well, in order to be eligible to be vice president, you have to be eligible to be president. So if you've served 8 years as vice president, there is nothing particularly wrong with being able to serve. So let's take a real world example. Bill Clinton was elected, or we could even go back farther a little bit. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. His vice president was George Bush Sr. He was reelected in 1988, and his vice president was George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. was the president elected from 88 to 92. So although he had served 2 terms as vice president, he was not disqualified from serving as president. The provision here is that you can't serve in the role of president for more than 2 terms. This has nothing to do with vice president. You are not actually the president. I know this sounds, a little bit, a little bit nuanced, but the nuance is important. So the following president was, of course, Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton served 2 terms. His vice president during those 2 terms was Al Gore. Al Gore tried to become president in 2000, and of course, as I discussed a little bit earlier, lost to George Bush via Supreme Court decision. But he could have been elected president, served 2 terms. Now, it would be interesting that could President Obama serve 2 terms, have Joe Biden as his vice president, and then Joe Biden run for the presidency, and Barack Obama serve as his vice president, switch positions. So 8 years of Obama, Biden, and then 8 years of Biden, Obama. Would this be something that would be possible? I think this comes down to, this is not a situation we faced. And this would be really a question for constitutional law experts to kick around. It would certainly be a debate. I'm not sure if there's actually a clear answer to that, although I would probably hedge on it falling more that it would not be permissible. Because if something happened to President Biden, would Vice President Obama then be able to assume office? Well, according to the 22nd Amendment, he wouldn't be. So that would be a sticky situation. But of course, as we understand, the Constitution amendments, they were not meant to be catch-all articles and legislation or founding documents. They're meant to be, guidelines for us to follow. And of course, there may be situations that come up, like the one that I illustrated, that were not envisioned when these particular documents were created. So I think that was our last question. Thank you very much to the American Embassy of Moscow, the American Center of Moscow. Thank you for listening to me for the last hour and all of these interesting questions. As I said, I'll take a look about the literature that you mentioned or you asked about, and I'll try to give some suggestions for you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and everybody stay safe and healthy. Good night.